Okay, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, to the Enterprise Excellence webinar series with Mark Graban on busting myths about just-in-time, the implications for healthcare supply chains. Welcome to everyone. I'm just going to start off with a few housekeeping rules. So as you'll see on your tab, there's a questions tab. There is a dedicated Q&A session after Mark's presentation, which will last for about 30 minutes. And you are welcome throughout the webinar to ask questions using that questions tab, and we will then go through them during the 30-minute Q&A time at the end. So that's pretty much it in terms of the functionality. And now I'm just going to go on and talk about the Enterprise Excellence Network and what we do here. So the Enterprise Excellence Network is a professional community that was founded by Professor Peter Hines and is exclusively for senior lean leaders in Europe. The network provides benchmarking events. So we have provided in the past quarterly networking events at bespoke and benchmark host sites, including Abbott Diagnostics and Hilti. So companies that are really representing enterprise excellence. And these enterprise excellence webinar series are really during these difficult times as a way of keeping people connected. So this is the first one of the series, which is delivered by Mark Graban. So now I'm going to hand over to Professor Peter Hines just to give you a bit of background on himself.
Yes, and hello and welcome to the webinar from me. I think Emma's managed to find the worst photo of me, but anyway, there it is. So I'm going to be sort of hosting this webinar, and Mark will be giving the talk, and so I'll sort of compare your questions. So as Emma said, if you want to put those in the question box, and then I'll pick those up at the end of the session. So with that, I'm going to hand on to Mark. So Mark, I think we've known each other for about 11 years. We happen to sit next to each other in a conference dinner in Nashville in 2009 at the Shingo conference, when we were both receiving a publication award there. And I think we both found out a little bit about ourselves. And as we were just chatting beforehand, I don't think we said, let's do a webinar together in 11 years' time, but we seem to be doing that. So Mark's, those of you familiar with Mark, Mark's work is very well known, particularly in the healthcare sector. And this webinar came out of a posting he made on LinkedIn, talking about just-in-time and in healthcare, which is obviously very pertinent at the moment. So with that, I'll hand over to Mark, and then we'll take some questions in about half an hour.
Well, thank you, Peter and Emma. I appreciate the invitation, and thank you to everybody who has tuned in to watch. Today, I want to share some thoughts, maybe around busting some myths about just-in-time and the implications, maybe not just only for healthcare supply chains, but also for people in other industries. I started my career in manufacturing. I spent 10 years really focused on manufacturing. I thought that was going to be my career. And now I've ended up working primarily in healthcare for 15 years. The slides and different links that I'll reference in my talk, links to books and videos and articles, can all be found on my website. There's a page, markgraban.com/JIT myths, and I'll put that up again at the end. So this is the first webinar that I've done in this era. You might call it the era of no haircuts, or in my case, last Saturday, it was the first home haircut that I ever received, thanks to my wife. We might get to see that later during the Q&A session. So I think that's called a teaser to maybe get you to stay tuned. But hopefully the thoughts that I'm sharing on much more important issues than haircuts will keep your attention over these next 30 minutes, because this era of the coronavirus and COVID-19 is an era of increased, if not unbearable, stress on the healthcare systems in different countries. So I'm sure we're all quite aware of headlines from different countries. Here in the US, severe shortages. In Canada, there are worries of shortages ahead of the expected COVID-19 surge. In England, sad to see a headline, and similarly things are happening here in the US of NHS workers having to wear plastic bags as protection because they don't have enough gowns. So how do we meet these needs? How do we plan better for the next time? How do we react now? There was a great episode of the Planet Money podcast that I listened to last weekend about this race, this reaction to make ventilators. And there are a lot of interesting efforts admirable efforts going on right now. But as the host said at the end of the episode, we're perhaps facing the greatest supply and demand mismatch in our lifetime. So as lean thinkers, and practitioners, we're thinking about, well, the goal is matching supply and demand. That might be difficult in normal times, but what about unusual times like today? I've heard some refer to the pandemic as a proverbial black swan, if you know the phrase made popular by Nassim Taleb. A black swan is a rare, unforeseeable, unpredictable, unimaginable event. Taleb said in a video that I watched that 9/11, for example, was a black swan, even though some warned about that threat. He said in that video that what's going on right now is actually not a black swan, it is a white swan. It was predictable. It was a matter of not if, but when. And a lot of the effects we're seeing are, in his view, preventable. He said fairly bluntly, there's no excuse for companies or governments to not be prepared for this. So the people would say, well, we couldn't have seen this coming. I mean, you didn't have to be as smart and as accomplished as Bill Gates to see this coming. There's a TED talk that he gave in 2015 that has been making the rounds more recently, where he warned that a virus like the 1918 influenza pandemic would spread very quickly in our modern world. So we said, well, this is unprecedented. It's maybe unprecedented in our lifetime. The last pandemic was just over a century ago. As Bill Gates said, we've actually invested very little in a system to stop an epidemic. We're not ready for the next epidemic. So we haven't stopped it. We haven't prevented it. The question then is, are we ready? Did we expect to be ready in different ways? So in my research and kind of gathering materials for the session here, I found a Wall Street Journal article. The headline is alarming. Just-in-time inventories make U.S. vulnerable in a pandemic. Low stockpiles at hospitals boost efficiency. And I don't think I would use the phrase boost efficiency. It might be more like cuts cost, but leave no extras for flu outbreak, yet alone a pandemic of this nature. And this is an article from 14 years ago. We should have seen this coming. As it said in the article, the University of Utah, like many big hospitals, carries a 30-day supply of drugs, in part because it would be too costly or wasteful to stockpile more. So that's a judgment decision. What about the waste of not having enough drugs or supplies or equipment or staff or rooms? Classic inventory planning theory and practice has often traded off the cost of inventory with the cost of stockouts. And in something as important as healthcare, and people continually point out that patients are not cars, I'd say, yes, that's absolutely true. Patients are more important. We should perhaps err on the side of protecting ourselves and our patients. As I wrote in my book, Lean Hospitals, when the cost of stockouts is high, and this could mean the human cost, we have to err on the side of excess inventory. So the question is, how much? How do we accomplish that? How do we plan and react to a pandemic? I've never had a hospital client say to me that our goal is to eliminate all of our pharmaceutical inventory. More likely, the problem statement that they're working on is preventing stockouts, even in normal times. And this is a problem in organizations before Lean. So I'm not sure the association between just-in-time inventories and our current situation is correlation, yet alone causation. But in this article, They said at the time, 77 other drugs are in short supply because of manufacturing and other glitches, such as shut down factories. And as I said at the time, the supply chain is horribly thin. That was true in normal times. So even if we wanted to magically pile up stockpiles of inventory, is that possible with our supply chain? Is it fair to ask anybody in any industry to suddenly absorb a 20x spike in demand? There was a blog post written by a doctor that went through some of the math here. That if a hospital goes from having 10 infectious patients a day that require special PPE and protections for staff, and you suddenly go to 200 of them, the need for masks goes from 10,000 a month to 200,000 per month. And if you're an academic medical center, you would probably need 2 to 3 times this number. So that might actually be a 60x spike in demand. Can any system, just in time or just in case or whatever, absorb a 60x spike in demand? This is a very difficult thing to ask. The radio program in the US marketplace had a very interesting piece a few weeks back, and the title here again points to just-in-time. It says the just-in-time manufacturing model is challenged by COVID-19. And they said at issue here is a model that, and I take issue with this, that focuses on low costs and low inventory. And I may be preaching to the choir here, but I said, well, wait a minute, lean focuses on flow and other factors. It's not, anybody can do low cost and unreasonably low inventory without bringing lean or just-in-time into the equation. Cost cutters can do this. There's a model where all parts arrive at the plant just in time. I'm like, well, what does that mean even in manufacturing? It's not like parts arrive on a truck one at a time. There's some element of batching. There's some element of inventory, even in a Toyota plant and in any other very lean organization. So the one myth that still spreads in the media and different industries is a myth that says just in time means low inventory, or even worse, a myth that says just in time means zero inventories. So what does Toyota say about just in time? We can go to their corporate website based in Japan. It's in English, but they talk about the Toyota production system as being, for one, about just in time. And you can see they describe it as making what is needed, when is needed, and in the amount needed. There is nothing here about saying we should cut corners on inventory or that the goal is low inventory. The goal is what is needed, when it's needed, in the amount needed. That's critically important in healthcare. So if you look at Taiichi Ohno's classic book, he says just in time means that there's a flow process. So if we have batchy, long, slow supply chains, is that really a flow process? Ohno says a company establishing this flow throughout can approach zero inventory. And I think there are too many cases of organizations that have put the proverbial cart before the horse. They've gone for low inventory without establishing flow. I was fortunate that early in my career, literally a Japanese sensei that I was fortunate to learn from, we were at a client, a manufacturing organization that had somehow decided that they should eliminate all of their inventories, and now they were struggling to meet customer demand. And the sensei said, and I thought this was quite reasonable, job one is meeting customer demand. Job two is low inventory. So we have to make sure we don't get those priorities out of sync. It's meeting customer demand without excess inventory. And the amount of inventory required to meet that demand depends on not just our production system design, but our supply chain design and execution. Going back to Ohno, he described just in time as an ideal state. He said, obviously, it's extremely difficult to apply this in every process in an orderly way. Every link in the just-in-time chain must be connected and synchronized. And again, I would argue in healthcare, we have not had that. So the idea that low inventory or just-in-time would be easy or achievable is something Ohno might have used, this phrase that he used in the book, that just-in-time seemed to contain an element of fantasy. Something made us think it would be difficult, but not impossible to accomplish. So I think where organizations have gotten in trouble is when they have thought just-in-time is easy. We'll just get rid of the inventory. But that doesn't work. So you might be familiar of the old analogy or parable about lowering the water to expose the rocks. And you look at a group here, the person in the boat is smiling because I'm sure they're looking downstream. And while it might be a challenge, they probably expect to survive. In the introduction to the book by Ono, Norman Bodek wrote, lowering the water level in the river to expose all the rocks enables people, to chip away at all the problems. So again, this takes time, this takes effort. So we may lower the water and we may expose some rocks, but we need a river that we can actually navigate and survive. In a more modern book, the Toyota Way Field book, the authors say, well, as long as the rocks, like problems, are covered with water, like inventory, it's smooth sailing. But if the water level is lower, the ship can be quickly demolished by running into the rocks. We don't want to see a stream ahead that looks like this, where our boat is only going to crash. So as we're trying to lower the water more gradually, expose rocks, that requires problem-solving capabilities, not just low inventory. As we ease into that, we can find advice from Shigeo Shingo in his classic book. And this was shared on LinkedIn recently by my friend Sammy Bari, who's been called the world's first lean dentist. So Shingo talks about using something called a cushion stock system. So Shingo was not making this unreasonable, easy leap to immediate just-in-time, that we run trials, there are going to be problems, and he didn't think it unreasonable to borrow from that cushion stock to protect against unforeseen problems. So there's this balance of, again, lowering the water without crashing the boat or the company or the hospital. So there's a further myth that says, and it equates that TPS is only just in time. Some people in some publications like the Wall Street Journal use just in time as a synonym for lean or the Toyota production system. But if we go back to the Toyota website again, they talk about the equal pillars of not just in time, but Jidoka. So the Toyota website explains this, and I quite often point people to the Toyota website. Jidoka can be translated as automation with a human touch. And what this means, it's about built-in quality. When a problem occurs, the equipment stops immediately, preventing defective products from being produced. So Toyota, of course, was innovative back in the day before they built cars, when their product was weaving looms. So here's a picture from the Toyota Technology Museum in Nagoya, this automatic stop motion loom. And you can see in this picture here, what's called a broken warp, that is basically defective cloth. And the innovation with Jidoka was that instead of one person, one machine having to constantly inspect for breakages, the machine stops automatically. So that's not as good as preventing the breakage, but at least stopping immediately is a pretty good strategy. So lean is not just in time. TPS is not just in time. The Toyota way talks about continuous improvement and respect for people. I think in healthcare, respect for people means respecting the patients and respecting staff by doing all that we can to not put them in an unsafe situation. Toyota describes what they call an integrated system. The Toyota production system, they would argue, I would agree, is a system. And there's a myth out there, unfortunately, that gets people in trouble that says you can adopt one piece of a system and expect to get the same results from the system. Ono in his book says, a company cannot simply ask a supplier to adopt this system, because adopting just in time means completely overhauling the existing production system. This might also mean completely overhauling the existing supply chain. Where do hospitals get masks and gowns and ventilators? What's the supply chain for producing, if you will, respiratory therapists and pulmonologists and ICU nurses? So there was a very recent TED Talk. This was not really predicting anything, but a doctor who gave a talk titled, "Why COVID-19 is Hitting Us Now and How to Prepare for the Next Outbreak." And in the video, she said, I think this is a statement of fact, COVID-19 has also revealed some real weaknesses in our global health supply chains. She says then, just-in-time ordering lean systems are great when things are going well, But in a time of crisis, what it means is that we don't have any reserves. So I think we should step back and ask, well, is that really true? Should we have reserves? I think yes. What's reasonable versus what's a once in 100 years pandemic, though? That's a more difficult question to talk to. But the doctor said if a hospital or a country runs out of face masks or personal protective equipment, there's no big warehouse full of boxes that we can go to get more. But there was supposed to be, at least here in the United States. We have literally had something called a strategic national stockpile. There was supposed to be a big warehouse, or it's actually 12 warehouses in secret locations throughout the United States. There was supposed to be the strategic stockpile, but was it enough? That's the question. So the doctor again says you have to order more from the supplier, you have to wait, it's coming from China. That's a supply chain issue. Because lean and just in time, this would be another myth, I guess, that just in time means ship all your production to China because that's a low labor cost country. That's not lean thinking at all. Toyota works to eliminate the time lag. When they built a plant in San Antonio, Texas is not in the midst of automotive industry supply chains. So Toyota brought a lot of suppliers to the area, and many of them are in literally a wing of the building that is rented out to suppliers to help create the conditions where just-in-time was possible. Toyota made very different decisions than many other manufacturers of medical supplies have made. So if we go back to Marketplace, their headline maybe more accurately could have said, instead of pointing to just-in-time, China offshoring manufacturing model challenged by COVID-19. Or the headline might have said, poorly managed strategic stockpile strategy challenged by COVID-19. There was a news article about hospitals in Minnesota, and there's a long history of a contentious relationship with the union, so that's part of the context here, struggling, and the Nurses Association model was blaming this quote-unquote lean model of functioning. It's strictly a cost-cutting measure. Like, well, no. There's nothing on the Toyota production system page, the Toyota corporate website, that talks about cost-cutting. I'm not sure if the word cost even appears, because low cost and low inventory is an end result of meeting customer demand with great flow. Somebody from hospital group said, well, even after going quote unquote lean, hospitals do keep excess inventory on hand for mass casualty events like a tornado or a terrorist attack, but not for once in a 100-year pandemic. So again, I think one of these myths here is that lean is all about cost cutting. That's not true. Hospitals have a long tradition of harmful and dysfunctional cost cutting before they ever learned about the word lean or the phrase just in time. So what could we do in situations like this, even with a once in 100 years pandemic? 3 possible strategies, perhaps. One is lots and lots of inventory. A second strategy would be speed in our supply chain, a responsive supply chain that helps address changes in demand. Now, again, a 60x spike is really difficult to deal with. So we can think about inventory, we can think about speed. We can also think about the idea of shaping demand. And this is where the idea of flattening the curve comes in. So why we're washing our hands, not touching our face, we're staying home, not just when sick, we're staying home in general, and maybe now we're covering our mouths even if we are asymptomatic. We can try to spread out or lower demand for healthcare services. So let's look at the first strategy. Was there enough inventory stockpiled? One article I read said, well, our data showed hospitals believed they were well equipped, only to see their stocks depleted in a matter of days. So inventory planning requires forecasting. And the forecasts were probably not good enough here in this case. So if we look at, would this have been possible? That hospital that now needs 200,000 masks a month, at $2.50 per mask, that would have been over $1.5 million to stockpile 3 months at that usage rate. Masks are not very large, so storing 630,000 of them requires really only a 600 square foot warehouse. And a rental cost is cheap. So if we look at the balance here, the cost of inventory is much higher than the cost of warehousing space. So again, people tried the stockpile strategy, but we're nearly running out. Nearly 12 million or more have been taken from the stockpile, and now it's almost empty. The Federal Emergency Management Agency recently ordered 180 million masks. Well, that would have been a $450 million stockpile, which might have been possible. Well, would have been possible, probably, would have been expensive, but compared to the cost of not having the masks, we might have chosen to do so. And even 28, well, I did the math off of a different number, 28 million masks. So let's multiply this by 6. It might require 1 million square feet of warehouse space. And a typical Amazon fulfillment center is about that size. So again, I think this would have been achievable. Again, it's a lot of money. It's a lot of space, but it's doable. Now we'd have to make sure we rotate that stock and avoid problems, because there's maybe a different myth, maybe not amongst lean thinkers, that inventory is risk-free. We've seen recently, even if you were to pull supplies from safety stock or emergency stock, surgical gowns were contaminated because of manufacturing problems, 9.1 million of them unusable. As ventilators have been shipped from the strategic stockpile, the one hitch, thousands do not work. So if we have equipment, we need to do proper maintenance. Maybe we need to cycle the ventilators out into use to keep them working and running. Even something as simple as face masks can dry rot, because I think in this case, the expiration date was, yes, it says here 10 years ago. So if piling up inventory is not a sufficient or ideal strategy, we can think about, the movie Top Gun. I feel the need for speed. Instead of bringing supplies on a literal slow boat from China, can we have supply chains that are faster, like a speedboat? And not just fast, but agile. It's not just a boat that can go in a straight line, but a supply chain that is a boat that can really change directions quickly. And I think that's part of the history with Toyota's supply chain. After the earthquake and the tsunami, there were problems and people blamed just in time. In 1997, there was a brake parts plant fire that destroyed their capacity to produce an important valve for Toyota vehicles. Because of Toyota's quote unquote just-in-time inventory, it ran out in just one day. And this could have devastated Toyota's supply line. But fortunately, the supplier, one of the suppliers, was able to retool and start manufacturing after just 2 days. To me, that's agility. And I think some of this points to Toyota's relationships with their suppliers that allow that sort of fast response. So there's a lot of agility taking place right now. Existing ventilator companies are working really hard and hopefully using lean methods to ramp up production. They can add hours, they can add shifts, they can work 24/7. They probably need to space out their people properly. But there's a certain limit to how much each manufacturer can ramp up, especially when they point to their own supply chain issues. We have other companies stepping in that never made ventilators before. Tesla has been designing a ventilator that's powered by their car technology. General Motors and other automakers are partnering up with medical device companies to work together to ramp up ventilation. And again, it's not just the assembly, it's the supply chain abilities that companies like GM have. In the UK, Dyson very quickly designed and is planning to manufacture ventilators. So it's great to see this type of agility. Agility might also mean, in this day and age, moving supply to where it's needed. So thankfully, the COVID-19 wave is not hitting all countries or all cities or all states at the same time. So there are situations right now where upstate New York, Rochester, Syracuse can send ventilators to New York City, where they are much more greatly needed right now. We might move supply from state to state or from strategic stockpiles to where it's needed now, keeping in mind that where it's needed next week or next month might be someplace different. So we can have agility in supply chain design or agility in our ability to react to shortfalls. So the final thing I want to cover here and this gets a little bit more practical how-to, that even in good times, in normal situations, I think there's a myth that Kanban means no inventory. Coming back to Mr. Ono, he talks about the quote-unquote supermarket system that was adopted in the machine shop around 1953. So a supermarket system is a strategically designed store of inventory because one-piece flow is not yet possible. Now, there are limits to prevent inventory from going to infinity or to some number that's larger than what's needed. So Toyota put in a lot of effort to make this work. They call this Kanban or the Kanban system. So back when I worked in manufacturing, I saw very lean organizations, auto suppliers that would use a supermarket because they couldn't do one-piece flow from, for example, various molding machines to various assembly cells. They couldn't do one-piece flow. They couldn't do one container flow because there were, even if they were working on reducing the changeover times on the molding machines, there was some batch size greater than one that was necessary. So the thing that buffers the flow is called a supermarket. So assembly cells may use a 2-bin Kanban system to pull from the supermarket as needed. And then the supermarket may use Kanban cards that go back to molding machines that get sequenced and leveled for the production plan that refills the supermarket. This might not be ideal, but it may exist even for a very long time within an organization we would describe as lean. In hospitals, we might have Kanban flow where a laboratory bench pulls supplies from a stock room using a 2-bin Kanban system. And then when inventory gets down to a certain level, a Kanban card may trigger a purchase from a supplier or a distributor. That distributor, there could be more legs in this chain. But supermarkets and Kanbans can work really well when we have stable production or stable demand. So if you look at something called the reorder point Kanban, in theory, in a perfect world, here's how it would work. Inventory would go down, and then right as it hits 0, more inventory would arrive, and we would see a sawtooth pattern over time. Now, we can't wait until we get to 0 to panic and order more. We set something called a reorder point, and then we determine a reorder quantity. But one of the important things here is to look at the lead time for getting more. The reorder point is basically the expected demand over that replenishment lead time. So if it takes 2 hours to get more supply from a stock room, our reorder point can be relatively low. If it takes 2 months to get more supply from China, our reorder point would have to be higher. But now in real life, demand is never completely perfectly flat. So there may be times, unfortunately, where we would have run out before more inventory arrived. Or it may have taken longer to get that supply that we ordered. So when there's demand variation or when there's lead time variation, we build in something called safety stock. And that safety stock protects us against high demand or slow delivery. Now, there are judgment calls here. How much do we want to lower the water to expose rocks in our supply chain? If the risk of running out is life or death, my recommendation would be to err on the side of more safety stock. There are certain supplies that might not be life or death, and we would treat those differently. So our reorder point becomes our demand over the expected lead time plus some level of safety stock. So in general, how would we determine Kanban quantities? We'd ask, what's the usage rate? What's the lead time to get more? And then most importantly, is there any usage variation? And the question that I've always used when planning and setting up effective Kanban systems is, well, what's the worst case usage during the replenishment lead time? Can this be predicted perfectly? No. Can this always anticipate the 100-year rare pandemic? Maybe not, right? But this is where we need strategic planning. We need foresight. We need risk analysis, not just an easy devotion to low inventory or an unreasonable devotion to low inventory. So in summary, before we go into Q&A, when times are good, Just in time rarely means zero inventory. Even in a lean system, when we have demand variation and the cost of stockouts is high, we need safety stock. Sometimes we need what might be called emergency stock. But the question now is, whose job is it to store and move it? We don't need every hospital to hold 3 months of 60x demand. This is where the idea of pooling variation, and this gets into inventory theory, there is good thought between strategic stockpiles, whether that's at a regional or a state or a national or maybe even a global level. But I think another lesson is not just focusing on inventory, but realizing we're well served by shorter lead times. And that's something we might want to rethink in the future. Lean provides frameworks, not easy answers. One thing I deeply admire about my friend, Dr. Sami Bahri, the dentist, is that he's not only read the books of Ono and Shingo, but he didn't try to blindly copy. He put deep thought with his staff and his employees about what do these frameworks and principles mean to us. So I would suggest, and the boundaries of this may be a judgment call, do what makes sense and then study and adjust. I think this experimental mindset, this PDSA approach is really more the core of TPS and lean than is low inventory. So with that, I want to thank you, and the slides and the links and the videos, a lot of what I mentioned in my talk can be found at markgraban.com/JIT myths. And so with that, Peter, hopefully we have some questions, or you and I can have some discussion about this or both.
Yes, thank you very much, Mark. Very interesting, thought-provoking, particularly in these difficult times. Just while we get some questions through, so please type in your questions. But while that's coming through, perhaps I'll start with one line of thought. Certainly in my long and distant history, probably about 25 years ago, I spent a lot of time working with Toyota in Japan. And one of the things that I noticed when I was working with them and the whole just in time was the vast majority of their suppliers were very close by. So hence they could react very quickly, they could come and talk to you. And it strikes me, if you look at certainly many of these things that we're talking about, gowns and masks and even more complex things like ventilators, as you say, they're coming in from China, often on a single source from some huge factory, and hence the ability of the factory in China to respond is very slow, but also it's only a fixed capacity. So what about things like going back to sort of multiple sourcing and certainly local sourcing? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that would be incredibly helpful, because we need to think about the speed and agility in the supply chain. And I think it's interesting, if we look to Toyota as a model, I certainly do. They're not perfect, but there's a lot to learn from Toyota. I get frustrated when, again, companies want to choose bits and pieces of Toyota's integrated system. So part of Toyota's approach, like you said, is local suppliers as much as they can in their production locations all around the world. They want to produce close to their customers. That's why they build pickup trucks in Texas. Toyota pickup trucks do not have great market share, but they advertise, this means something in Texas, that these are the only pickup trucks built in Texas by Texans. And okay, that's true. But they have suppliers in Texas. They have suppliers, I don't know the exact percentage, but I would bet they very rarely have a specialized part that they have to ship from Japan to the US. In fact, I know this is a fact. When you look at studies of which American-built automobiles, American-assembled automobiles, have the highest percentage of American parts content, it's always Toyota, which I find fascinating. They're not bringing parts across the border from Mexico. They're not bringing parts in from other low-cost countries as the norm. So I think it's just, I wouldn't expect just-in-time to work when all of our suppliers are a really long distance away. And I'm not sure why other companies would expect that to work either.
Sure. We're getting a few thoughts and questions. They mostly seem to be about saying, thank you for a great talk. Here's one question coming in. Can you expand on the role of forecasting? Much of production is being based on forecasts, but will forecast ever foresee a 100-year event? That's coming in from Lars.
Yeah, I mean, forecasting is necessary to decide when we build a new factory, right? So those are longer term forecasts. If we can build a factory more quickly than we used to build it before, that reduction in lead time would be helpful in terms of our agility. If you look at the 60x increase in demand, I think one of the challenges with the manufacturing agility model is that it would be, I'm sure, completely uneconomical for a producer of masks to have, a huge 59/60ths of their production capacity going unused on a regular basis. Like that capital expense would be unreasonable. So maybe that's where we have to point to the inventory accumulation strategic stockpile strategy. But again, that requires forecasting. But again, I just don't believe the idea that we could not have forecasted how many supplies would have been needed in a really bad pandemic. It seems like you could have gone through the math, as this doctor did, of how many interactions is there with a isolation patient every day, how many people, how many times, how many masks are used per patient. Like that math would be doable, but again, it's based on the forecast. I didn't point to it here in my talk, but one of the other, I would even call this Kaizen, continuous improvement strategies to reduce demand for things like masks and gowns are modifications that nurses and doctors have made to equipment so that a control panel for a ventilator can be out in the hallway so that it can be used and accessed without somebody having to put on a new gown and a new mask. And then when they don't have enough gowns and masks, now people are being forced to wear the same gown and mask all day, which is problematic in other ways. So, I think I laid out 3 strategies. It probably requires a combination of the 3. Inventory levels, manufacturing agility, and demand mitigation / Kaizen strategies.
Sure. And I think the speed includes the local sourcing that we were talking about a minute ago as well, I suppose, that you reduce this. So we got a few more questions coming in. So the next one's from Stephen, who asks, how would you implement, if at all, self-manufacturing methods such as 3D printing during this extraordinary event?
How would I implement them, or how would I?
How would we, as the global nation, I suppose?
That's a good question. I've seen stories of that happening, and maybe this is partly a Kaizen strategy, or a demand shaping strategy. So if you look at the demand for ventilators, the traditional model has been 1 ventilator, 1 patient. This is controversial in medical circles. There are pros and cons to this, it seems, but in Italy, I read about people using 3D printing. So maybe this is something that reduces lead time. We can 3D print a part faster than we could go get a mold made and make parts in more traditional ways. But they were 3D printing parts that would effectively split the ventilator flow to 4 patients at the same time. And I've heard others doing similar things to split ventilator use to 2 patients. So again, I'm not a pulmonologist, I'm not a respiratory therapist, and like I said, this has been controversial because there's risk of spreading other infections by sharing a ventilator like this. So yeah, it seems like 3D printing has been part of this quick response, lead time reduction aspect of our reaction.
Sure. Well, linked to that was another question here coming in from Francis, who's asking, where do you see the role of Internet of Things combining with Lean to achieve these sort of goals?
Oh gosh, there's another topic that I also don't really know much about.
I'm really glad you're answering the questions, not me on this one, Mark.
Well, I mean, I don't know what I'm trying to think what the Internet of Things would tell us about usage or inventory levels or what have you. I mean, I have seen people do utilize technologies to help automate our knowledge of how much inventory is in a certain location. So like one of my pet peeves, I won't rant about it too long, is that, before Kanban systems, hospitals use something quite often called a par level system, which is very similar to the reorder point Kanban approach, but instead of having a set reorder point and a set reorder quantity, people come through on a set interval and literally count how much is there on the shelf right now, so they can order up to a certain level. That's hugely wasteful in terms of motion and talent and what have you. But again, like if Internet of Things sensors are telling us the warehouse is empty, I don't know. I don't mean to be flippant about that, yeah. But that's a good question. I don't know if I have a better answer for that.
Okay, well, let's another question's coming from Sandeep. How do we control JIT when we don't have flow?
How do we control just in time when we don't have flow? So I would think of, the old approach, like when I started in the automotive industry, given the choice, the managers would pile inventory to the ceiling, right? They and they would struggle to do that because of our production problems. So there's this catch-22. They wanted inventory to protect against production problems, and they couldn't build up inventory beyond demand because of said production problems. So there were a lot of flow issues, and these were management problems, they were quality problems. These were not problems with the workers. But I think one of the lessons is, like, when you don't have good flow, or when there are barriers to flow, these are the proverbial rocks in the river. If a river was really dangerous, you might wait for it to flood before you tried taking your raft down that river. So, I mean, again, like, I think there's this dogma that some have interpreted, just in time means let's get rid of all our inventory. Well, the company I did an internship with in grad school had severely damaged its business by utilizing that approach before I came in. And so part of my master's thesis was try to figure out, how do we recover from that, and how do we build the correct safety stock levels, for the want of a relatively inexpensive image sensor. They were losing sales of $15,000 digital cameras, right? So it's what's the expression? Penny wise, pound foolish. I think revisiting Shingo's work is interesting to show, like, how practical he was being, and the Toyota Way Field Book and Bodek in Ono's book warn us against lowering the water too quickly. So, we need flow, we need problem-solving capabilities. Like, exposing the rocks does no good if we're just going to go crash into them because we don't have problem-solving skills. So that's where, there's this integrated system. It's harder to explain what the Toyota production system is. It's easier to say, oh, it's just in time. It's harder to give that more, that lengthier, more nuanced, more accurate description of that integrated system.
Sure, good. We've got two more. They're sort of slightly linked, but I'll ask you the first singular one, and one's a more plural one. So the first one is another Stephen with a PH this time. With the lift in demand for PPE, etc., in this crisis, how are companies redesigning their supply chains to satisfy demand?
So from the standpoint of, that's a good question. From the hospital supply chain, it seems like they are quite often trying to partner up with local manufacturers. There's a great example I saw from Minnesota, where an alternative to a ventilator, where the patient is intubated and it creates what they call a closed system. So droplets and Nothing is being aerosolized and coming out from the patient. That's sort of the ideal, and that's a good thing about the design of a traditional ventilator. When you don't have ventilators, what you can use in a pinch is something called an ambu bag, which we might have seen on television. It's used typically more by EMS when they say, well, we don't have a ventilator, but we need to artificially breathe for the patient. And it's a mask that goes over the patient's face, and you literally squeeze this bulb that's maybe the size of an American football. And you have to squeeze it and squeeze it and squeeze it, and you can do this manually. Well, this hospital in Minnesota, there was a doctor who reached out to a local engineering and manufacturing company where they designed a simple mechanical arm that could basically pump the bag in an automated way. MIT students developed a similar, simple, creative technology like this, where they've open sourced their design and they've published it on the MIT website and said, hey, if you've got the supplies and the capabilities of making these, please go forth and do good things. So some of that is local response. Like a lot of the manufacturing companies that have pivoted, and there's a company in New Jersey called Unionware, a great lean manufacturing company that makes hats and backpacks and things like this. It's and I heard an interview with their president and owner who said they realized that the supplies and bill of materials that they use to produce a hat, and they also produce plastic binders for some reason. They said they could take different parts from the hat, the sweatband, the band, the plastic, and you know what? Now they're making face shields. And so there's been a lot of creativity and agility. It might not be ideal, like people and companies that are making cloth masks, not as good as an N95 mask, not as good as a surgical mask, but a lot of that seems to be happening very locally in people's communities instead of waiting. I know, one aspect of the supply chain is that, companies in China are ramping up production and will be shipping things here, but even if they air freight it, that might be slow. So the other question then comes back to pharmaceutical companies, medical equipment manufacturers. How will they rethink their supply chains to do more production in local countries? I hope there's more of that. I think for a number of reasons that would be a helpful strategy, but that's good. That once we've, at least in the United States, eliminated a lot of our manufacturing talent base, it's easier to buy equipment and put up buildings than it is to hire people who are trained machinists and other people with different manufacturing skills that we don't have here anymore. Because it's become a catch-22 where people say, oh, we'd love to do manufacturing here in the US, but all of the suppliers are in China, so let's just assemble it in China. Well, I mean, it's a big challenge. Thinking back to Ono, I'm gonna pull up Ono's quote, like doing more manufacturing in the US or more manufacturing in the UK might be, I'll go back to Ono's quote, it may contain an element of fantasy, but it might be difficult rather than impossible to try to do that in coming years.
So a few more things. This is probably a comment from Stephen with a V, who's saying that in Israel they converted ambo bags to automated devices, perhaps similar to your example you were sharing. And probably the last two sort of link a bit. So Lars is saying, what are the best way in your opinion to bust the myths? And I think that links a little bit with Meryl's question of saying, we've talked a lot about what industry might do with flow. What about government? What's the role of government in this pandemic and helping in these areas? So maybe myths and government, I suppose.
Yeah, so maybe on the government piece first. I think it would be a nonpartisan, apolitical issue to talk about the role of government providing strategic stockpiles. If it's not economical for any individual hospital or individual health system, I would think of a strategic stockpile as being like the fire department or the roads. Like there are some functions where it's reasonable and or more economical it's more economic, like back, so I think there's an important role there. But then the question comes back to how much are you supplying? I don't think it was an inaffordability issue when you look at the dollars and the space involved. I didn't run the numbers on ventilators. That might be that would be.
So on that point, I'm just sort of thinking that if you take a different example that is not dissimilar, and certainly in the UK, when they think of the environmental agency that looks after rivers, they plan flooding for a 100-year event, which is what we're having here in healthcare, and they build bunds or levees in American terminology to cope with a 100-year event, and it seems like we haven't done that in this pandemic at the moment. Yeah.
I mean, and then I think around how do we bust myths? My gosh, that's some of these.
So you only have 3 minutes to answer that one. So
well, okay. I mean, we've been trying to bust some of these myths for a very long time. So how do we help people be more curious? That's a difficult question to answer. I as often as I can, I try pointing people back to source material, like the Toyota page about the Toyota production system, books and references that it's a judgment call I think are credible, or at least they line up with what I've been taught in my career. How do we get people to go and read that web page? How do we get people to challenge deep-rooted beliefs and practices? I mean, that's a really difficult psychology and change management question. It's the old joke about, how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is, well, none, as long as the light bulb wants to change.
Yeah.
And the same question might apply to leaders. We can help leaders learn if they're willing to learn. And human nature makes us very uncomfortable. I think this is where the phrase cognitive dissonance comes in, where let's say somebody was taught that, just in time is as easy as get rid of all your inventory and you'll figure it out. It's hard to unlearn, or people get really anchored and say, well, here's what I was taught 5 years ago. That's really difficult to work through. What do you think, Peter?
I don't know. I mean, I suppose all of us that are out there, doing talks, doing webinars, writing books, we're all trying to help people to understand and get the message over. And maybe there's some healthcare or government people listening to you today that, this might help a little bit with. I think it's just continue to get the message over, and maybe we should be trying to counter things on LinkedIn when we see that, people are talking rubbish or whatever. I suppose all of us can do that.
Yeah.
I'm just going to do one more question. We've got come in from Nigel, who it's quite a long question, but I'll read it out. So what he says is, rather than attempting to maintain our crisis stock holding, how well do you think we can take time to conduct problem solving and reflect on our learnings with PPE consumption and develop a playbook so that when we hit a set threshold of consumption, we implement actions like the ventilator out of the room that you mentioned, instead of continuing to consume at the same rate until stocks are deplenished?
Well, I mean, I think that a lot of that's already been happening in necessity, but now this is where I get frustrated and worried and scared for people. When PPE stocks have been depleted, suddenly the standards, quote unquote standards around PPE use get very flexible. And so, well, that's not a standard if it's dependent upon how many masks and gowns we actually have. So, there have been strategies that probably should have been adopted sooner. There were recommendations in the U.S. at least 3 weeks ago to tell hospitals or to recommend hospitals stop doing elective procedures because you're using masks and gowns that are better, that are more urgently needed in other places. Should that and on cord, if you will, have been pulled sooner? Probably. The panic reaction to build more ventilators and masks and things maybe started in the United States 3 weeks ago. In terms of lead time and response time, I mean, it would have been better if we had done that 2 or 3 months ago. So now it becomes a question of government and political leaders. Were they in denial and hoping that this wouldn't be a problem? I think we'd all agree hope is not a good supply chain strategy.
Well, I think we can agree that some governments have probably handled this better than others, and the ones that locked down quickly were probably the ones that will buy time or flatten the curve the best, and evidence will tell us which was which. I think a final comment to wrap us up that comes from Robert is quite a nice one, and his comment is bust myths with facts. And perhaps that goes back to the PDSA that you mentioned earlier, and problem solving and more flexible and agile supply chain. So good. Well, on that point, I think I'm going to wrap things up because we said we'd go on for till 3 o'clock UK time. I'm just going to hand back to Emma, who's just going to wrap up. So if we could just move on to the next slide, Mark. Just to remind.
Yes.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't have that slide. That could have been my error.
That's okay. Don't worry.
We can.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you, Peter. And thank you for everyone for attending. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, I will be contactable via our website, the enterpriseexcellencenetwork.com, and you'll see my contact details there. But just to finish off, I wanted to launch a quick poll just to gain your feedback on this webinar. And when you exit the webinar, there'll also be a short survey question with where you're able to give us your feedback on who you would like to hear from in future webinars as well. So I'll just launch the poll now. And thank you very much once again for attending.